To be engaged with art is to be engaged with the positive side of madness. But there's these things that they want out. They want expression. They want to exist in the exterior world in some form. And whether that's, you know, a painting, a piece of pottery, whether that's, you know, your Vincent van Gogh, who he had so much just banging on these doors for 10 years straight, 900 paintings that needed out, you know? And you realize that society needs these types of people. It needs the artist. It needs the writer, the filmmaker, the podcaster.
Welcome, everybody, to the Robert Meets World podcast, where we discuss everything from the metaphysical to the practical and everything in between. And I am once again thrilled. I love bringing on all the guests. I feel like I say this on every episode, but this episode, once again, I have a phenomenal guest that I'm speaking to. His name is MJDorian, and he is an artist, educator, podcast creator, and award-winning composer. He is the host of the exceptionally produced Creative Codex podcast, and he provides a compass and compendium to exploring the arcane world of creativity, covering figures like Alexander McQueen, Carl Jung, William Blake, Da Vinci, and more. Additionally, it is my opinion that MJ has a spectacular talent in straddling what can often feel like the nebulous world of creativity, but in a rational way that doesn't lose sight of the transcendental and mystic power of creativity and art. In addition to this, MJ is an avid explorer of the sort of meta game, if you will, of the world and existentialism in forms of understanding occult symbolism, archetypes, and more, and seeking to fundamentally understand how and why these symbols, archetypes, and processes continue to emerge and affect us in our everyday as well as our artistic pursuits. So I have a ton of different things I want to talk to you about in this podcast episode, MJ, but with that being said, welcome to the program.
Wow, Robert, thank you. What a wonderful and warm introduction. I really appreciate it. It's fun to hear or the kind of the auditory mirror of yourself reflected through someone else like that. Yeah, man, I appreciate that. Thank you. I enjoy your show and your inquisitive way of approaching all of the topics you do. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, definitely. So, MJ, you are an award-winning composer. You, according to my history, or some of the research I did, you kind of were producing scores for films and different movies for about 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And then in 2018, you started this project, Creative Codex. And one of the things that stood out to me initially was, well, I came reference from somebody who was in my opinion, a philosopher. And they mentioned, okay, you got to check out this podcast, Creative Codex. The production quality is so high. And what's become more apparent to me is just how much of Creative Codex is a labor of love. So I want to start with, in 2018, this idea of Creative Codex emerging and what the sort of vision for you was, stepping out of, I think, what was a previous ambitious project that you were working on.
Yeah, no, sure. I'm happy to start there. So, I mean, I've had a lifelong fascination with this question, which is in essence at the heart of Creative Codex, which is, what is creative genius? And where does it come from? Can we encourage it? Can we discourage it? Does it just kind of arise spontaneously? How does it develop? Why do figures like a Kurt Cobain, like a Basquiat, like Emily Dickinson come along only once every generation about, and then kind of completely turn their medium upside down and then disappear sometimes within the span of 27 years or something? And how does that happen? Why can somebody achieve so much in let's say only 10 active years versus people who are creative and they're going at it until 85 and they, although create works of substance, they don't rock the world and create these massive changes in culture. So in many ways, that's at the heart of the show. It's an investigation of that. What is that? Is that even something, biological and psychological, or is something else at play, which is kind of the recent topic I've been exploring in the Tarot series and the most recent episode, the idea of that there's a spirit of creative genius that, in a sense, we almost like tune to, and then once you're tuned into that compels your work toward like these higher aspects, these greater heights. So I would say that that's at the heart of it, and it's been from the beginning, from 2018, and since I was a teenager, and I started, playing guitar and all that stuff.
Hmm. And I mean, there's so much in there. So, I mean, you yourself, you've been a creative all of your life, so to speak. You've been producing. I mean, you're multimodal. You draw, you compose music. You've done film series with your Catharsis album, which I'd love to discuss as an ambitious project. But even this most recent point that you've mentioned here with the sort of spirit of creativity. I mean, somebody I spoke to once said that the idea of art has kind of changed over history as well. Historically, you used to be inspired by the muse, right? It wasn't an act of the individual self-expression, and it's only been recently that that has been turned upside down. So I guess, what's been your personal relationship in that sense? Have you felt through your journey of art that it's been more of an extension of self, of personal expression, or do you feel a sort of connection to a, what would you say, archetypal channeling of sorts?
Yeah, I mean, wonderful points. The whole conversation can be just about this if we wanted to. There's so much there, and I would say both in my investigations of the writings and journals of artists, and knowing artists very closely that are best friends, and knowing my own journey with art forms, I can say with high confidence that artists get the sense that they're only like half in control of what they create, and that sometimes their greatest ideas, the ones that kind of come out with a flow and with ease, they kind of have their minds boggled about that themselves too. So artists themselves don't really fully understand what's going on, and there is often this sensation that something else is speaking through you, that you don't even fully understand the work until after the fact, when 2 months later somebody in an interview asks you, so what was that video about, what was that song about, and then you have to create an answer. You have to craft something that sounds intelligible. But in truth, when it first comes out, it can be like this kind of lightning bolt that just courses through you. And that's one of the remarkable things about it. Well, there's still a magic to that. As much as reductionist thinking and our modern world has kind of shined this light and disinfected so much of what used to be mystical, I think creativity very much still has that, and artists recognize that. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. And one of the, I hope this is a fair classification, but one of the meta frameworks that you approach creativity through is sort of the Carl Jung, Jungian psychology perspective of, I suppose, to go back to what you're saying, that channeling of something. That channeling could be from the unconscious. It's that distinction between the conscious and unconscious. And so you often explore a lot of these modalities through this unconscious. But even Jung has this idea that, and you've made this point, that there's sort of the archetypes are kind of being embodied by us, so to speak, and that's kind of the dual possession in a way.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to be said about archetypes, and there's these ideas that go back very, very far into recorded history, that today skeptical minds may say, oh, these are things of the past, we don't think about this anymore, but they still have their threads today. So this idea that I presented earlier about this spirit of creative genius, right, that people in a sense are tuning to or behaving as such, as if it is influencing them in these examples I gave. Well, the further back in time you look, these things were very common. In ancient Greece, it was called a daimon. You had a personal daimon, or there was the daimon of a place, of a certain city, or people. In Rome, then that changed into the term genius. So there was, again, there could be the genius of an army, there could be the genius of music, and you can make offerings to the genius to kind of appease it, or to, in a sense, tune yourself more to it. It's a guiding force. There's a guiding spirit going on there, and there's an acknowledgement that there's factors that are influencing us that we don't fully understand. That continues through various faiths. I know in Slavic native faith, there's something called the dola, which each person is born with, that gives them certain skills and traits. And it's written that one can, even if a doula disagrees with you, it's this guiding spirit, that later in life you can basically create a ritual that will change your doula, and you'd get another one. So today, we may think, oh, these are superstitions of the past, but in our language and in our way of speaking about life and human affairs, we still refer to the term spirit. And so there's the spirit of the Renaissance. There's the American spirit. There's an argument can be made that there's more than one spirit of a country, that one people or side of the country can be tuning into. There's all these examples, in our common dialogue. There's when you say, oh, he gave that speech in a very spirited way. What are we referring to? It's the same exact concept. We're just perhaps not making the offerings anymore, but we're behaving as if it's still an influence,
Mm-hmm. And, I'm so struck because even when you're describing things like that, like I think about video games or any of these things where you have clans or you have guilds or you have these affinities to these, or even, what would you say, like in native traditions, a spirit animal or these kinds of things, that there are these affinities or tethers or strings that are psychologically somehow they're still attached to us. And it's the disembodiment. I mean, do you think the disembodying of that is kind of, I mean, every time, at any point in time in history, everybody thought we were in crisis. But do you think the disembodying of that is kind of leading to, what would you say, a disconnect with the human spirit and the spirit of humanity in modern day?
So if I would have, been asked this question a year or two ago, I'd say, yeah, we're in a point of crisis. We're in a downward spiral, and America is going to collapse as a nation within the next 5 years. I'm not sure if that last statement may or may not still be true, but the idea about how humanity is doing, I think that there's some optimism there, because when you look at history, when you become a student of these trends and periods in time, you start to realize that whenever society starts to go too far in one direction, let's say like the reductionist thinking of the scientific revolution, or you look at something like the late 1800s, where globally there became this phenomenon where people became just taken by this spirit of the occult and investigating, spiritualism, and people would have seances and all this stuff. And you can't explain what's going on there, aside from that this idea that the pendulum swung too far in one direction, and now people were course correcting, that they felt a need from kind of a collective depth, in a sense. And this was a global thing. So, if we have a very narrow present moment view of what's going on in the world, we can have some red flags come up. But I think there's more always at play in what Jung would call the collective unconscious. That there's these swings and these currents that we're not aware of, that in many ways guide cultures in certain directions. And so today, that what can be seen in these guises is people's interests in ceremonial magic, in Western esotericism, in alchemy, in everything from Freemasonry to Rosicrucianism and secret societies, that every once in a while someone hears about it and they're like, okay, what's this? Let me look this up. And just this, of course, New Age is included in that too. So those undercurrents, I think, are always there. And when people who are intuitive and sensitive enough start to feel their lack, they start to find them again,
Mm-hmm. And even I think Jung talks about this in, I can't remember if it was the undiscovered self or what it was. It was the role of the psychiatrist as the kind of priest, or it's like the doctor has inherited the spiritual advisory capacity. I guess kind of speaking
like
somewhat to what you, sort of, right? And that's what he said, is like, as a psychiatrist, it's now our people are no longer going to the confessional, they're going to the psychiatrist to try to I guess engage some of that. But you did mention Jung here, and I have this I have this really weird thought about Jung. I think his ideas are so fascinating, but on one end I have this I don't know if skepticism is the right word, but I have this idea. One idea is, maybe it comes from the postmodern, perspective on I guess everything, right? Everything is narrative. There's just these meta narratives. And one of the thoughts I have is, what if within Jung's framework of ideas, because it's so tortured in so many ways by so many different people and places, is it possible that in some way, if you could view kind of Jung's work as a franchise of sorts, like a sort of Star Wars franchise, and sort of operating in that kind of world, we're sort of developing these ideas, but it might not be the biggest perspective. Does that make sense when I say that?
I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to get at. I mean, like we could take that, you know, line of reasoning. So what are you trying to elaborate here? Like, let's say if we're looking at it in this franchise sense.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing, so what is it that draws us to Jung, right? Well, we're trying to understand this framework of the unconscious. We're trying to then understand, if my understanding of Jung is correct, we're trying to understand, hey, we have this collective unconscious. It contains this collection of fundamental archetypes, which are kind of running the drama of life, so to speak. I mean, if you were to divorce from Jung and you bring into like a Hindu tradition, or at least my understanding of the Hindu tradition, you have the Atman and the idea that we split all of our, that splits into every person, and every person is a manifestation of that, you know, divine essence. And so it's curious to me, I guess, when you go to the Jung world, is it sort of, do you think Jung captured in enough of a generalized and abstract sense what's going on? Is it sort of the ultimate framework to approach things with, or is it sort of just one piece of it? Because in parts, I guess when I go to Jung, I get worried because some of his ideas are so tortured in some way, and I guess every person suffers from that because of interpretation. But I have this sort of skepticism sometimes that I wonder, are we just sort of under the auspices of the collective, the idea of the collective unconscious, and what if we could sidestep that?
Gotcha. Okay. So I think I see where you're going. So I would say that, you know, I've studied Jung's writings now and really tried to understand what he was getting at and how he was viewing the mind and humanity and our inclination toward everything from, you know, spirituality to what's going on in dreams and art. I would say that Jung is not perfect, but he's the best we got. Like, as far as a framework for understanding these unknowns about the mind, these enormous question marks around our humanity and our existence, he's the one that comes closest to giving us a workable framework, especially for people who are artists, who are people who are spiritual in their own lives, and, you know, other threads of psychology, like the Freudian thread, until very recently, looked at spirituality and religion in a very pessimistic way, like, you know, a fantasy fulfillment and stuff like this. So Jung provides a very effective framework for at least beginning an approach to those things. And one of the, I think, really amazing consequences of his framework becoming more well-known and widespread, and the way he applied it in a very rigorous way, where initially he was just writing for clinicians, for fellow psychotherapists. He didn't, for more than half his life, he didn't want his work to be in the public. He wanted it to be in the private practice. I think because of the way he approached it, he sidestepped people's skepticism about these kind of traditions that are more spiritual, that you could say holistic, or, you know, traditions that where the subjective experience of somebody in reality is just as important as the objective experience outside. And so because of that, he as a consequence caused people who would have otherwise been skeptical about spirituality and these kinds of traditions and something like divination to start engaging with it and start saying, like, okay, well, you know, he's presenting it in this very clinical way where it's only psychology. He's removed it from metaphysics, and whether the metaphysical part exists or not, if we just look at it objectively, what's going on. And so his great kind of, you could say, trick in that regard was taking people who were very scientific minded and then, like, bringing them over to this camp where it's just this irrational terrain, and saying, like, hey, there's value over here. And then once they're tricked and they get there, they realize, whoa, wait a second, nobody's talking about this. this is amazing stuff. This is a whole nother facet of humanity that opens up in these doorways, in the, in this vast hallway of questions. And so for now, I think it's the best we got. I'd love to see somebody else attempt to explain, all of these things that he spent a lifetime trying to decode and theorize.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what's intriguing, I guess, about Jung is, I mean, he had this dual, I think it was while he was doing some of his Red Book experiments that you talk about in your Red Book series, like he had this note that said, even as he was, because he was a deep introvert, if my understanding is correct, like he was, although he was a clinical psychologist, he also, had his own little world. And when he started diving into his own depths of his unconscious as documented in the Red Book, he had this point about kind of having 2 feet, like 1 foot into the reality. I don't know why balloons, but
I don't know what you did, but it's exciting. It's a party in here. Dua Lipa's on.
But he had 1 foot in I guess the real world, and then the second foot into the deep subjective world. And he made this point that I think you mentioned that it's almost as if, and this is, I guess, where some of my maybe skepticism of Jung kind of comes, because I worry if it's all subjective, right? If it's all just subjective truth, then there's no kind of what could you say, like collective objective alignment on what is true, right? It's like the subjective world can be infinite in space, and even if you look at some of Jung's work in diving into his own unconscious and all the different symbolism and the layers of that, there's a worry, but I think you capture it quite well, as like it's the best we have. Do you have any inclination as to somebody who might be leading off after Jung?
Well, I just wanted to riff on that for a second,
Sure.
because Jung isn't saying let's get lost in the subjective completely, because that will just be entirely chaos and everyone disappears into their room and into their own fantasies and doesn't come out, or speak to each other for years. He understood that there has to be a balance. The idea of psychotherapy is that in psychoanalysis, you go into analysis because for everybody, there's complexes in there. There's aspects of yourself that in many ways can sabotage you in your life in very real, tangible ways. They can sabotage your relationships with people, with intimate partners. They can sabotage the career you're pursuing, because you have competing motivations at all times, even once you resolve the ones that are personal complexes from your childhood. And in something like psychoanalysis, you're not just going in there to play with dreams and like get lost in symbols and archetypes. You're going in there with a purpose. You want to better understand the mental terrain that you're working with. And like I've been going to psychoanalysis with a Jungian analyst now for over 6 months, and so now I have a very tangible understanding of that. There's just loads of books. If you want to get lost in Jung, absolutely, that's easy to do. He has so many collected works, so many volumes that people just get totally heady with and lost in it. But the actual work is sitting down with yourself in a journal with a psychoanalyst, and you work through this stuff and you come to understand what is influencing you. And oftentimes it's not pleasant. You're opening up corridors in your mind that have to do with trauma, that have to do with personal strife, have to do always there's a father complex, there's a mother complex. Maybe there's some people that have a father complex but not a mother complex. Maybe they had a good relationship with one of them, but oftentimes you find that there's stuff you have to untangle from both. So there's real work to be done, and it has a tangible benefit and an effect in your exterior world.
Mm-hmm. It's almost as if, and maybe this is sort of what I was leading into in some sense, is that it would seem, let me try and post it up like this and tell me what you think. It's as if you lean too far into the spiritual modalities or occult or this kind of infinite abstraction or this infinite subjectivity, it can destabilize you from being human, which is the
Totally.
concretization, right?
Totally.
And
I've known people that happens to them, where I've gotten into conversation with them, haven't spoken to them in a year, and then they tell me like they seem a little bit like out of it with their speech, and then they say they've been astral projecting for like the last month, and then they tell me like weird stuff about like when you speak from your spirit, you know, you can do anything. And then I'm like, what have you been up to, guy? And, you know, and then he tells me he's been like on these other dimensional planes, and he just speaks for an hour, and he's lost. He's just completely removed from reality. He has no tether. He has no, you know, significant other. And I feel for him. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Sorry to interrupt you.
No. I mean, it's you know, it lends to this fascinating question, right? Because some of these people are talking perhaps at these levels, right? And there is a question about. I heard this line which says, "Society is a collection of people who have decided to forget something in common." Right? And so by virtue of our ability to socialize one another, we necessarily have sort of what Nietzsche might describe as useful but false information, in the sense of, you know, I look at, for example, the idea of a corporation. A corporation is a fictional person by virtue of my understanding of the legal material, right? It's a story. We say that this is a person, even though if you look, you're like, well, this isn't a person, right? It doesn't have two arms and two legs. And so when you get to that sort of untethered state, there's a question or curiosity into me about, is there something, you know, is that person grasping into a world that's sort of the future or where we're going? Or is it sort of, should we look at it from a perspective of concern that they're untethered from reality? Obviously, from the survival capability, right? If you're unable to pay for your groceries because you're like, dude, I can't, your body is protecting, you know, your spirit is protecting out of your body and I can't focus. But maybe it goes back to what you're saying, where it's a balancing act between those two things, even if it's quite crazy. Do you understand a little bit what I'm sort of getting at?
Yeah, no, it's a fun topic, you know. So I would say there's a certain passage from Marie-Louise von Franz I was recently reading, and she was a colleague of Jung. In a sense, she carried the torch after his passing in analytical psychology, and she herself is incredibly well versed and accomplished in her research and in her writings afterward too. So in one of her books, she describes the spirit toward creativity and in general art, and what it is to be an artist. And in this really short passing phrase, she mentions that to be engaged with art is to be engaged with the positive side of madness. So immediately that, you know, brings to mind all these figures that, you know, I study and I spend so much time with in Creative Codex to, you know, write out their biography and figure out what was going on in their life. And you realize that society needs these types of people. It needs the artist. It needs the writer, the filmmaker, the podcaster, people who are, you know, traversing bridges that other people aren't going to, that are going into mental terrain and even spiritual terrain that people in their common lives have either completely forgotten about or never heard of or never reached. You know, someone like a Nikola Tesla, we need those people who say like, well, there's a better way to do this. And then everybody doubts them until they figure out that there is. And then that becomes, you know, the electricity for the next century as the dominant form. And so they have a real function in society, I think is what I'm trying to say. And every once in a while, somebody goes too far. And yeah, once they become untethered, there's a danger to that. Because yeah, you lose a sense of connection. And there's certain traditions that recognize that, like the tradition of Jewish mysticism called Kabbalah. In its older forms, it was very specifically said that it was only once you reached 40 years old, you were established, you had a family, that you could start reading and practicing Kabbalah. Because of this very reason, like there's a danger that if you pick it up too soon, you become so obsessed with it. There's so much rich complexity to, you know, soak in, that you stop going to work, that you stop thinking about, you know, getting a family or getting married. You just become lost in it, and you're very pleasantly lost. It's a wonderful thing to get lost in, you know.
Yeah, and I do want to get back to Creative Codex, but even this point that you've mentioned, it touches on something I have here that I wanted to discuss with you as well, is that the information density of art and creative aspects. So particularly, Jung would say, I don't know if this is what Jung would say, but my understanding of Jung is that dreams serve as a information dense conduit of information. It's not like just spelling out like, hey dude, you did this wrong and like you should go this way. There's layers and layers contained in that narrative and metaphor and symbolism. That's a deep transmission that you're not, I mean, you're even lucky to get 25% of it through your own, I'm familiar with some of Robert Johnson's works where you do the dream analysis in that way.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I guess what you're also pointing to is there's a risk of getting lost in your own cartography of your inner subjective world. But at the same time, we need to, or what would you say, there is a social benefit of the explorer archetype or explorer class, so to speak, even if there's a danger, I suppose. I guess there's always a danger in exploration, though, right? Exploring the physical world and prior to the places in the map being filled in.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's part of what draws some people to it, is because there's a dangerous element. There's, artists are often given the permission to be weird. And in a sense, there's an expectation that an artist should be a little weird for that reason, because we want people to be out there exploring some weird shit that nobody else could possibly think of, because it freshens life up, It's like if there was no art or drama or narratives or poetry or film in the world, like, what are we doing here, right? Like, we become lost in just menial day-to-day tasks. Art, in a sense, reminds us again about these deeper senses of our being and meaning and purpose and our connection to one another. And it's a deep rabbit hole.
And so then let's land back into Creative Codex here. So you mentioned that you are then studying these great figures, as you mentioned, to try and unpack, I suppose, what is the animating spirit of these people. Is it biologically driven, as you question at the start? And obviously you've covered a number of different figures throughout your program. You're covering it through this macro lens of Jung. Now, in particular, of the figures that you've covered, I guess, who has surprised you the most in terms of how they develop their own creative genius?
Sure. I mean, there's surprises, honestly, every single time I engage with any of these figures. There's many times where I'll engage with someone like Emily Dickinson, who was just kind of a ubiquitous figure of English literature that I heard about many, many times. Sorry. And it wasn't until I was like, okay, let me do this episode because I feel slightly obligated to cover somebody from literature. And then I start reading her poems, and I read ones that I've never heard of before. And I'm like, oh, okay. Wow, there's like a lot of stuff going on here with the metaphors and like metaphors within metaphors. And little by little, I start to just become completely enraptured by her work, and just this idea that the poems are a reflection of her mind itself, digesting reality and her own life. And so that was a big surprise. I basically ended up, by the end of that series, I ended up feeling like I was in a one-sided platonic love affair with Emily Dickinson. I'm still waiting for her to write back, but it was because I got so engaged by even her personal letters, and you get the sense that you have this connection with this individual just through her writing alone. You get this intimate sense of her mind and her way of thinking, and you fall in love with it. And so that's one of these figures as an example. Then there was someone like a Vincent van Gogh, so who's again this ubiquitous figure of art history. I learned about him in high school in art history class, and his sunflower paintings and some of his portraits. Everybody does. And then I start to, open it up, look at his biography, and I start to see like little tidbits every once in a while that like perk up my interest, like the fact that he didn't start his life as a painter. He wasn't doing art much when he was a kid. Everybody in their family did. And then at one point in his mid-20s, I believe it was, he starts to pick up the brush because he's failed at his life so far. And over the course of the next 10 years, with his brother Theo's support, monetary support, he creates 900 paintings over the course of 10 years. Like, that number is just mind-boggling. Like, how often somebody must be thinking and creating art. It just becomes all they do. Like, there's no time to eat practically. And there wasn't. He was, practically destitute aside from his brother's support. And so stuff like that just, all these figures, there's always something about their life and the details about what they did and accomplished that, always surprised
me. You mentioned this compelling, like I wish I could capture it in the same way that you said it, but you said Emily Dickinson's work was a reflection of her digesting of reality, then manifest in. Is that in some sense the pivotal role of the artist? Is like, for example, let me offer an analogy or a similar experience that I have, like reading some of Dostoevsky's work, and you read through the the metaphors, and then it leads to a Pushkin poem, and then this Pushkin poem has some significance in Russian culture for some reason, and you're seeing this, what you would not expect as sort of what's the name of those fairly complicated machines that accomplish only one task?
Yeah. The starts with an R, I believe. No, not the Rubik's, obviously. Starts with an R, I think.
I think so too. Okay, we're on the same page. I'm going to put it in the show notes if I remember. But it's one of those very, very complicated machines that's like turns a wheel and then it hits a like a bowling ball, and the bowling ball goes up.
Yeah,
and it's this massive tethering of all this, little tidbits. And I think it was in reading Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, where you're having these like small divergences of daily experience, and then they layer upon layer, and then somehow through, I suppose, that mechanism you mentioned, almost unconsciously, it then spits its way out onto the painting or spits its way out onto the paper. How much of, I guess, the role of the artist is that, where it's being, because sometimes I think if I'm approaching it with a, what would you say, egotistical vanity perspective, you're like, I'm going to sit down at this painting and paint something and it's going to be amazing, right? Instead of viewing it more with an element of, lack of control in some sense.
Yeah. It's sometimes a form of possession, honestly, and creating a work of art can feel like an exorcism. Like you end up feeling an actual pressure in your mind and the cells of your being that you have to go over here and grab a guitar and let something out. And that's honestly what it feels like a lot of times for artists. And that comes with learning a medium, that comes with learning the basics of a craft, because before that, you don't have an avenue for those feelings and thoughts and insights that are kind of knocking at the door. And you could argue that that's sometimes, what causes some people anxiety, because there's stuff that's knocking on the door back there, and they don't have an outlet for it until they find something like dance, until they find something like martial arts. And there's not only competing motivations, but there's these things that they want out. They want expression. They want to exist in the exterior world in some form. And whether that's, a painting, a piece of pottery, whether that's, your Vincent van Gogh, he had so much just banging on these doors for 10 years straight, 900 paintings that needed out, So it's weird. And it's the only way to understand it is just that it does feel like things need to come out.
And it's almost beautiful to put that. It's almost in some way, like I think in the Scandinavian countries, I think it's Sweden's in particular, music is so critical in the culture that all students are required to find some sort of instrument to take, I think, till high school or something like this. And so it's almost, I mean, in some way art is encouraged in school, but there's, I guess, if you're being graded on art, is it the same is it the same thing?
No, there's, you have to say that there is an aesthetic aspect to art, which is very subjective. And then there is the craft itself, which is what you first have to study and gain your skills in. Then there's also like the fact that you can be creating art in a very specific style, genre, and time period. If you're trying to do a painting from the time period of the Renaissance and you want it to look a certain way, well, then you can be judged and graded on how well you accomplish that. If you want to do a song in the style of trap music of like 2010, it's a very specific genre, a very specific time period and style. You can't do a whole host of things because it won't sound like it. And so there's aesthetic considerations that have to do with style and time period. And those I think you can be judged on. But then there's the subjective element of whether is this good? Is this, does this make me feel anything? That's up to each individual listener and audience member.
And it's the necessity, as you mentioned, to build. It's sort of this like Nietzsche put it, but Nietzsche was he was quite an elitist, but he put it very well in this one line. He said, you need to study the great. I'm totally gonna not paraphrase this correctly, but it's like one, because he was a poet, but it's he said he was criticizing German education because it said that it let students write their own individual essays too early in their development. And he was of the opinion that they should study Goethe and I guess I can't remember what the other names were, but some of these great German, Schiller, some of these great German writers, because they're being offered individuality too early in their development, was according to Nietzsche, that they needed to be shaped, be molded by these great minds before offered this, what he, I guess, described as an incendiary, like it's too hot, it's too, so it's almost that humility and that frustration with just being able to emulate, I guess, the masters in some way before one can imprint their mark.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to be said for that. That's the traditional way of, since the Renaissance, of learning an art form. You apprentice with somebody, and this is what happens today in something like tattooing. There's literally, you are an apprentice to a tattoo artist before you are allowed to stick somebody with a needle and get paid for it. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that, because in learning there's a lot of trial and error. And so when you're picking up a craft, you have to become really good at the basics and have a strong foundation. And there's a great reason for that afterward, because to create consequential work, any work is always in the context of the history of that medium. So to create a film that's consequential, well, it not only has to mean something to you, it also has to mean something to this film buff over here that knows, every work of Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese, and he knows the literature of film and can, recite a script from Stanley Kubrick. So to create work that matters within the fabric of society, you have to feel positioned in it, and to do that, you have to be well versed in it too.
And so you mentioned, okay, so back to Creative Codex. Let's land back in Creative Codex. This is my timeline here to keep our conversation going.
Thank you for constantly bringing it back as I derail it every single time. Thank you.
Well, it's
I'm horrible at self-promotion here.
No, the interesting part of a conversation for me is I love to explore the frills, but in some way, it's funny how allegorical our conversation is back to Jung, right? You go really deep into this subjective, this outer space, this explorative thing, but unless you have this grounding back to a story, and it's so with Creative Codex, you mentioned you started in 2018. prior to finishing something you called an ambitious project. And you have an episode on that. I can't remember which episode number it is, but it's a creativity tip. It says pick ambitious projects. And the second episode is have a vision for something. And so prior to starting Creative Codex, you had this very ambitious project entitled Catharsis, which if my information is correct here, it was a full conceptual album. You wanted to write all the music as a musical composer. You needed to create artwork, real original artwork for all this. And then you shot a music video for all of these things. And throughout this process, you created an alternative identity, I think is what you called it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that identity had a name or was it just...
Yeah, it could be known as Dorian or just MJDorian, because obviously that's not my given birth name. So that ended up being also this moniker of this character.
And so MJDorian became this alternative figure. Can you speak to us a little bit about that project? Because I think it touches so much on some of the items that you mentioned here, where it became a possession, an integrative experience, wherein you mentioned, parts of your lives you'd be thinking about it and something else would come in. And I suppose why the importance of having that vision and seeing things from an integrative perspective can be valuable, even if it was quite a difficult project.
Yeah, no, I'd love to speak about it. I mean, so it was this project where it had come on the tailcoat of me working in the film industry for about 10 years. And in those last few years, I got this sense that the directors of that time period, anyway, they didn't want to really hear melodies anymore. They did, which is something that I'm very passionate about and that interests me about music. They didn't want to hear, traditional, like orchestral setups with the sound and everything. It was going very, very ambient at the time. And this was very much the influence of composers like Hans Zimmer and stuff like this, where, instead of the theme being like the 30 notes of like a John Williams theme, it now became like just 2 chords. Dun, dun. And that's it. And it's like, that wasn't interesting to me. That wasn't engaging. So I ended up, as one of the reasons for falling out of film scoring was that. But as that was happening, I got this like impetus in me to be like, hey, you used to write songs when you were younger. That was like your first introduction into music. And so from that, there was this inclination to now pursue something that was slightly foreign to me, which was like hip hop, where there's rappers involved, kind of like in the band The Gorillaz. And also writing songs in the traditional sense with melodies and getting in contact with singers and working with them, because I have a horrible voice for singing anyway. And I could do everything else. I could do the music, I could do the lyrics and stuff like that. And in the process of that, I maybe, I'm possessed by something like one of these spirits. And so I think even bigger. I say, well, I also can do art. So why don't I do original piece of art for each one of these songs as kind of a functional cover art, and also each song should have a music video. And this was incredibly challenging and one of the most fulfilling experiences with creative work that I've ever had, partially because I ended up working with so many people in the process, working with singers, working with rappers, working with a saxophone player, working with people who are filmmakers to create these music videos. And so, I would wake up thinking about it. I would, in the middle of my, job, as I had like a little break between students, because I teach music, like 15-minute break, and I'm kind of at the piano, and it's a seed for the next song I'd be working on for the next year. And then I would go to sleep thinking about it. And it was, in that regard, it was really, really wonderful. It gave me a really clear framework. You have your life, your daily obligations, and then there's this big mythopoetic tapestry that you're working on that is so engaging that anytime you want, you can just kind of like check in on it and do a little bit over here in a corner, work for 5 minutes over here. So that's what it looked like and felt like for a period of about 4 years, I think.
Now, that's such a beautiful image you mentioned here too, because I have such a burning question about this. Is I'm assuming there was difficult parts of this project. There were maybe parts you thought about quitting, or was there not? Was it because it, like, did you give yourself a deadline and then there was a pressure, or was it more like, what would it be? I don't know if it was Michelangelo or who it was, where you would, as you mentioned, you do these little parts here and there, and there's no sort of constraints grounding the project.
Yeah, the only constraints I would say were monetary. By the end of it, I was a few $1,000s in the hole, and this was just money spent, going. I wanted to do this official. I wanted the musicians to feel appreciated, so I paid everybody. If I was working with a rapper, I told them this is, how much I can pay you, and they said great. And let's go in the studio, and pay a studio fee. Not do it out of a bedroom. Let's and so there's money involved. That was the only constraint. Because otherwise the creative vision said I have to finish what I feel like is an album, and by the end it has to feel like a completed product, so that I can bookend it and say, okay, I'm done. If something comes from this, like, people discover it and want to hire me as like a music producer, that'd be great. It'd be a nice, cherry on top of the sundae. But if it's only this, at least I have something that I'm proud of, that, I really compelled a lot of growth out of me.
Mm-hmm. So was it a particular monetary budget, or did you say, okay, I have to complete 12 things? Because I'm trying to figure out, one could equally get lost in that world of you just add a few more, and then there's the paralysis of perfection, wherein you're like, okay, well, it's not good enough. I need to erase this side here, add in a bit more, and then you sort of, I say you ruin the work, because this is what I do. Is like, sometimes you edit it too much and you just you hate it in the end.
You lose the original spirit of it.
How do you yeah, like, what is the balance therein? Is it because that's what constraints do, is they force us to make those decisions to say, okay, well, perfect, grid is better than perfect.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, it's, are you still tuned into the creative vision that compelled the work out of you at the start? So you can get lost in the details, you can get lost in, the manual labor of it. But every once in a while, you got to just double check. Like, am I still on the same ride, that I started? Is the fire still there, that, compelled it out of me? And is that vision still true? And for me, I was fortunate enough that, I kept on it, and it may have been part of what this obsessive element of it, that kept me tuned into it the whole time. But it feeds you, when you get engaged with something like this. It sounds like a lot of work, but if it's something that you're passionate about, it's incredibly engaging, and it's a life-giving energy. You go into work with a great attitude, and everybody is, frowning, and it looks like you just had, 3 cups of coffee. And it's because you were in the studio earlier in the morning recording like 3 saxophones and a trumpet for this great song that you're working on, and it gives you, something. It gives you back a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then you jump into Creative Codex. You then had you finished that project, and then you had a new vision. This vision was to map the world of what is this question of creative genius? And so you've been doing it. You're I think I don't know what the tarot episode is, but it's, I mean, the creativity tip was like number 29, but you're 30 plus episodes into this exceptionally produced podcast. Like, you write all the music that go into it. You do the voiceovers. The research is obviously incredibly in depth. Where is Creative Codex going?
I mean, right now, I can say, fortunately, I'm still tuned into, just to use the parlance of those terms we were just using, I'm still tuned into the creative vision that it started with, and I'm fortunate for that. And so it's just going. I have, a list of figures that it's extended into the hundreds of people that could still be covered by the show in a meaningful way. So it's going to keep going. I don't know. it's maybe eventually I'll have to be replaced by an AI or something. But I'm gonna keep going, and whatever other avenues as I get more time, maybe as the income stream increases from the show and whatnot, I'll be able to quit one of my day jobs and then have more time to do things like write a book, develop a live show, which I'd love to do with the Creative Codex vision, where I play music, and there's also other musicians, and we talk, and there's a lecture aspect. So in terms of where it's going, maybe those aspects are worth mentioning. This idea of a live show, this idea of a few books, while still producing, episodes in the same standard of quality that I have been over these last 7 years. Yeah, so it's over 50 episodes now. Yeah.
How do you balance the what I would describe as the there's a lot of love that goes into your show. There's like a deep love and craft. It's
thank
very
you. Thank
apparent.
you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
But on the other hand, there is a what would you say, a pressure of productivity in the world to get the next episode out, to grow the following, to do X, Y, and Z. How do you personally manage those confounding or counterbalancing factors to stay? Because you could maybe release a couple more episodes faster, but then the quality depreciates.
Yeah. I mean, that's essentially the game you're playing as a quote unquote, content creator these days, is whether to release quantity, which you have certain benefits to doing it that way, in terms of like the algorithm tends to be more friendly toward you because it sees that people are engaging constantly with it and all this stuff, and you can stay on top of trends more because of that. Or to release quality, which there's no faking quality. Basically, just like a good handyman, you can ask, do you want this to be done fast, or do you want this to be done well? There's only one of those two that I can do. So at the end of the day, whatever I'm releasing, I have to let it meet my standard of quality that I'm happy and proud to put out there, knowing that there's people all around the world that are listening to this thing, and it means something to them, and I have to respect that. So that's why I didn't put ads or approach any sponsors with it for 7 years of the show, because I respect my listeners too much. I don't want them to be, engaging with something like, what is active imagination, and exploring the depths of your unconscious and your complexes, and the most heady and sometimes occasionally spiritual things, and then to be like, so maybe go to Target tomorrow because they have a great sale on diapers and vitamin supplements, or like, I couldn't do it. I just respect people too much and their time. And when I hear emails and messages from somebody who's in Iran who says, we have no art programs here, and your show motivates me to create art. I'm like, wow, crazy. I hear from someone in Ukraine who, during the day job is a soldier, and then at night sits around, illustrating tarot card concepts while listening to the show. I'm like, it boggles my mind. So the connection to actual people, I think, in the audience also makes me like, okay, I gotta stay serious with this thing.
Mm-hmm. And how much of your own motivation is driven from an internal, like that alignment to the vision versus because let me try to line this up. I feel as though you mentioned a few elements here, right? The algorithmic visibility, the concept of building an audience is something that I mentioned, right? And these are the external validations. And in some way, what you're pointing to is I want to build something that I am proud of, but also has a quality bar that perhaps stands the test of time, right? You could still listen to Creative Codex in 10 years and it would feel as fresh as today, whereas a TikTok video of a particular dance maybe not. But how much of that balance for yourself, personally speaking, would you say you have? Is it a more bias towards the internal vision? Has it become slightly more about the external validation as time has gone on? Because I feel like it would be a natural thing, and then there's a balancing act there too.
Right. I mean, I love validation. It's really nice. It's really nice for like anybody to reach out to you, even if it's one person, and say you did something meaningful, right? Or they enjoyed something, or you see the numbers on whatever thing you released, increase, and you're like, yeah, I'm doing great stuff. I know, finally, it's validations. It's a hell of a drug. But at the same time, at the end of the day, yeah, I need to be proud of what I'm working on, because otherwise I don't have the energy for it. It requires so much of me to open up a book and read the whole thing, and then underline the important parts, and then make notes, and then read another book. For every one of these figures, it's multiple books that I go through, and then to figure out what the narrative is and how does this relate in the context of the entire. It's too much work for me to do if I'm not fully engaged with it, and if it's not giving back something to me creatively and even spiritually, you could argue. So I think it's a balance. It's the exterior and the interior.
But it's also, I think, the leveling. I think that's part of the thing is, right? So I mean, in the start, it's only internal validation, right? You're just doing it because you're like, this has to be done. And then as you sort of get some of that external validation, like there's this concept of audience capture, wherein at some point you produce, you sort of begin to perceptually bias the content or things that you do, because it will break the, what would you say, the constraints of validation of your audience. And so I often think about some musical artists, and I used to be very critical of musical artists, and I'd be like, oh, why did they change the way that they started producing, music? Like I used to like a lot of what they did. And then I realized that, well, for them to be able to explore their own internal creativity and expand themselves, personally speaking, they have to sort of break my bias, right?
Yeah.
And if they stay in that, I mean, they're going to be audience captured, so to speak, and then eventually that will die off.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why I love learning from looking at figures like David Bowie, who, when I first was introduced to his work, I would listen to one of his songs at random, and I was like, it doesn't do anything for me. And then I would listen to something else like Ziggy Stardust. I'm like, wow, how does somebody get there? Like, what is that? So the only way you get there as a David Bowie is to do some crap sometimes. Because you're not going to find the gold if you aren't letting yourself be led by that kind of creative vision. If you're completely only following trends, you're always going to be a little late, because the trend is already there. What's popular, what people want to see is already there. But at the end of the day, if you're being honest to yourself and intuitive with what is going on in your mind, that's where the original ideas and the compelling things are really born. So I think that's really important. Every good artist has a large deal of intuition, and when you listen to that, not only will it drive you towards something that you find personally meaningful, but it's also more often than not going to be significant to at least a few other people. A great lesson to me during the show's years of production was the Red Book episodes of Carl Jung, episodes 11, 12, I believe. So, those episodes are, the first one is the most listened to episode of the show. And I remind myself that as I was getting to, episode 10 and about to do this next one, I was like, you know what? I really love this book. I don't see anybody else talking about it much. And I just find it completely fascinating. So even if nobody listens, I'm going to do it for me, because I think it's really good. I think it's really interesting, and the world needs to hear it. And I didn't think anybody was going to find it interesting or listen to it, which is what's crazy. And in the process of putting it out there, then this whole swell of a undercurrent of an underground Jungian community finds it and shares it, and then is contacting me, and people who never heard of Jung end up stumbling on it, and because they're curious, because they heard his name. So that was a great lesson to me, that if I feel something is worthwhile, even if nobody's going to listen to it, just do it, because somebody out there is going to find meaning in it too, you know?
Yeah, and there's a lot of personal faith and courage to do that as well. It's a courageous step into individuality. But as we get to the end of the show here, I need to talk about this topic, and I need to get your thoughts on this.
Sure.
Rene Girard was a French intellectual who had a theory called mimetic theory, and it sort of to summarize mimetic theory in way too few words, was something to the effect that humans don't know what they want; they just copy one another. But he did a lot of analysis of literature to come about his theory, and one of his theories, I'm going to read it here because I can't articulate it quite in the same level, is literary analysis suggests that great novelists often underwent transformations where their personal vanity and self-absorption was transmuted into profound artistic and collective insight. In later works, authors frequently critique their earlier work, their self-indulgent, efforts, and refining their craft into something less pedantic and more universal. How much of this have you seen in the figures that you've studied? This initial ego obsession, what I look at through the lens of art as this, I need to express myself and myself matters, to this then sort of reorienting to the collective impact upon the world.
That's really interesting. I mean, I would say that anyone who sets out on the path of any of the arts and has this sense of like, I'm going to be great one day. Like I want to be great one day, or I want to create something substantial. And you could argue this was something that Kurt Cobain was thinking about. Even though he was starting in Seattle in a punk music infused place that then turned into grunge, and you're not supposed to want to be great. You're not supposed to want to make it from a place like that. You're criticized for having any kind of aspirations. You're supposed to grind and be cool and take drugs and not care if anybody listens. But you could tell in his writings and his music, once they get to 1994's Nevermind album, you could tell those were his designs. He wanted to be a superstar rock. He wanted to prove people wrong from his hometown, and that takes a certain level of narcissism. It's like a healthy dose of narcissism.
Or vanity.
Or vanity, yeah. There's a certain sense of, not necessarily that I deserve to make it, but like, I really want to be out there. I want to be in the mix. I think I can create something that people are really going to jive with. So that kind of motivation, I think, is what propels people to towards certain heights of greatness, especially when it's paired with like genuine talent and interest in the craft. Like if it's just the narcissism, then you end up, going the route of becoming famous, doing whatever you need to do to become famous. But if it's that paired with the sense of understanding your craft and wanting to create something substantial, go further with it, and you create some really special works that stand the test of time. So I think that's part of it, for many artists, like somebody like Salvador Dali, let's say, who by the end of his career, though, he became more he went down that line a little too far, and he became kind of a caricature of himself, and becomes this caricature of what it is to be like a creative genius. He dies kind of like a sad, lonely life because of it. But I think that's an element of it.
Yeah, it's almost this it's so fascinating because there's so many elements where you're what would you say, there's a necessity to the less the self-indulgent. There's a necessity to the self-indulgent characteristic that proves to be useful in utility to the collective, unless taken too far, in which it's sort of that you live long enough to become the villain, so to speak. But there's that letting go the process in some way.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue it's, an aspect of the ego itself. That there's a false understanding, I think, especially in something like New Age circles, that we have to like get rid of the ego. You got to get rid of it. No good. Not serving us. It's the thing that's the problem with capitalism. But it's like, well, no, your ego. Yes, it's mostly about self-interest, but it's got all of these forces that it aligns with that compel you in directions and give you energy. And if you've gone through things like therapy, you start to work on the things that are maybe the bad motivations and complexes. Or if you're very mindful and more self-reflective, you can do those things even without therapy. But the ego is a necessity. It's a positive element, or it can be, the positive element that compels you toward your creative goals and successes. And it's the thing that also allows you to stand up straight and say, no, I'm not going to take it. Like, no, you can't do that to me. What do you think you are? Like, there's a lot of positive aspects of, having a kind of a well-developed or a healthy ego,
Mm-hmm. Jung would put it better, but perhaps it's the alchemical catalyst, right? That serves towards the end product. MJ, I could speak to you forever, but we do have to wrap up the show here because I want to be respectful of your time. Just before we sign off, is there anything that you want to leave the audience members with? Perhaps something inspirative quote, anything like that, maybe where they can reach you, or any additional things that you want to leave anybody with?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Check out my show. I'm always there until eventually I'm going to be replaced by an AI and no one will know. And that's at Creative Codex. You can find it on any of these podcast platforms, especially Spotify, Creative, and then CODEX. I'm also on Instagram at MJDorian. And yeah, there's always insights to be dug into and explored and shared through those avenues. And I thank you for creating the space here for that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, MJ. And for everybody listening, thank you for checking out the podcast. Be sure to subscribe on all the podcast provider episodes, and we will catch you next time. Thank you again so much, MJ.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it.